want to introduce our guest for tonight, Dr. Sarah Coleman. She is Assistant Professor of History at Texas State University in San Marcos, a historian of 20th century America with a focus on immigration, race, and rights in the United States, especially when those topics intersect with questions of politics and policy and social movements. She completed her PhD at Princeton University in 2016 and was a National Fellow at the Miller Center at the University of Virginia, which is one of, if not the premier places for the study of politics and the presidency in the country. Before she went and got her PhD at Princeton, she did what I like to call a couple of years of public work at a historic home in Washington, D.C., otherwise known as Senior Policy Analyst for Domestic Policy in the Office of Vice President Biden at the White House. Perhaps her greatest achievement post-White House, post-Princeton, was the 2 years she spent here as a postdoctoral fellow at the SMU Center for Presidential History. I'm sure you will all agree. She was here just for a couple of years before she headed off to San Marcos for her job as a history professor there. And since then, she has published this book, which is the subject of our talk tonight with Princeton University Press. The book is The Walls Within: The Politics of Immigration in Modern America. So tonight, we're going to do things just a little bit differently. Rather than a straight lecture presentation, we're going to do kind of a live Q&A here, with Dr. Coleman, where we'll talk through some of the book and some of its ideas and arguments and great stories. And then afterwards, as usual, we want to open it up to Q&A for you all and continue the conversation from there. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Coleman. I gave you the hopefully functioning mic. Yeah.
Thank you for having me, and it's so nice to be back here at the Hilltop. It's this was where I spent the majority of time writing this book, was here in Dallas Hall, so it's really nice to be back.
Okay, so I want to start out with just the kind of classic first question, which is, where did this book come from? How did you come to this project, specifically the idea of focusing on immigration and immigrant rights?
Yeah. So I think one of the things that's always been fascinating to me about immigration, and I think you see this in today's headlines, right? So much of what we talk about is about the southern border, right? If you open the newspaper front page, we're often going to be talking about the southern border. But there are about 25 million people who live in the U.S. today, right, who are here living permanently, right? About 12 million are undocumented. About 13 million have legal permanent residence status or some other form of legal residency in the United States. And to me, what was always interesting is the immigration question is so much more than about just the southern border. And I felt like we needed to have a more comprehensive look about immigration policy, right? That's 25 million people in the United States. Let's have a broader conversation about what it means to be an immigrant in the United States, what rights they have entitled to, and how has that changed over time? Because that's also part of our immigration policy.
Okay, so immigration policy, like a lot of other topics, has like points in American history where things change, and there's oh, this is new now. And so for you, I know in the intro you talk about 1965. What happened in 1965, and why was that such an important turning point?
So 1965 is sort of a critical moment in both U.S. history more broadly and immigration history more specifically. And so in the 1920s, the U.S. had implemented sort of a very restrictive immigration regime based on national origins quotas. And they said, the number of people who can enter from any country is 2% of what they were here in 1890, which basically meant that anyone from Southern and Eastern Europe, right, you think about Italian or Russian or sort of that area, suddenly faced new restrictions. And we said in the 1920s, we're going to have national origins quotas. We want to sort of prioritize Northern and Western European immigration. And we're going to bar Asian immigration in the Asiatic barred zone. And we're going to have this system in place where we use immigration as sort of a form of mass racial engineering. And so that sort of period in American history is this big clampdown between 1920 and 1965. And in 1965, many things are going on in the world, right? We have the Cold War. We're trying to win the hearts and minds of countries around the world, right, to join our side in the fight against communism. But we have these restriction immigration laws that say you can't I know you want to join our fight against communism, but by the way, you can't come here, right? We're also in the midst of civil rights movement in the United States. And at that moment, there's this huge call where these domestic policies come together with foreign policy. And we passed something called the 1965 Hart-Celler Act. And it's passed sort of in this moment of the Great Society, right? It's a year after the Civil Rights Act. It's in the same year as the Voting Rights Act. And it's the idea that we should really apply our immigration laws more fairly. And this 1965 Act basically changes how the immigration system works in the United States. And in the unintended consequence, it dramatically changes the demographic profile of the United States. So we move away from the majority of immigrants coming from sort of Western and Northern Europe, right, to large immigration from Central and South America and from Asia. And sort of this moment where we have this idea that we're going to equalize our immigration laws in a new way. And and part of it says we're going to equalize sort of and give everyone an opportunity to come here. And it also changes sort of the system by which we enter. So most of our immigration today happens through family reunification or employment. Most of the pathway to legal immigration in the United States. And those priorities are set into place in the 65 Act. And most of the 1965 Act is sort of the system that we're dealing with today.
So, like, I think most of us, if you spend any time here, you think about the U.S., this kind of phrase, nation of immigrants. But obviously, over time, that changes. So something you mentioned, I'd like if you could explain a little more. Back to the 1920s, you're talking about racial quotas, and you said that it was kind of a form of racial engineering. Can you expound on that? Like, was that purposeful? And if so, by who and for what reasons? What does that mean?
So this is a moment in the United States in the 20s, right? We're in the moment of eugenics, right? And there's a lot of the pseudoscientific racism sort of circulating in popular thought. And immigration is also just having a massive wave. This is a time period sort of with the present day is sort of the other big moment of immigration to the U.S. And eugenics comes, and there's this huge sort of influence of the eugenics movement in U.S. immigration policy. And in particularly a man called Madison Grant. He wrote this seminal text called The Passing of the Great Race. And he had these ideas that you had these hierarchies of races and that people had certain immutable traits, right, that could be passed on to the next generation. And the argument that the Immigration Restriction League and many of the people who were kind of key supporters of the 1920 changes, right, where they were worried that the American stock was being diluted, right, and that part of what made America, and this sounds similar to what you hear today, right, part of what made America, right, America was that this strong leadership stock that was based on like Norwegian, sort of this Norwegian, and they didn't want what he called, Madison Grant called the Alpines or the Mediterraneans, right? They didn't want that influence. And so by changing, right, immigration law, they could change the racial engineering, so they viewed it as a way to sort of racially engineer the population of the United States.
Via laws, like particular laws aimed at accomplishing particular makeup. Oh.
But there's actually, and I'm going to go back to this, there's a really interesting carve-out, right? So is a huge, huge clampdown in 1920s, but the support of agribusiness and Southwest growers carves out the Western Hemisphere, which becomes important in 1965 because we're going to start capping the Western Hemisphere. But basically, agribusiness and a lot of the Southwest growers carve out Western Hemispheric from the Western Hemisphere from these caps because they want to continue to have a source of labor from Mexico and Central America.
So what role does that play then in 65? There's a carve-out from the 20s to the 60s where there are quotas for groups all around the world, but not for the Western Hemisphere because powerful lobbies say we actually need as many immigrants from that area as we can get. So what then changes with the Hart-Celler Act in 65 with that group?
So they have this moment where everyone says, okay, this is equality, right? We need to equal out, right? And so now everyone's going to be subjected to a cap. We can't just have the Western Hemisphere cut out, right? So there's this kind of ironic moment where there's this moment where it's seen as like, okay, we're going to equalize, right? But the sort of unintended consequence is they don't take into account historic streams or proximate nations. So like everyone in the world is now getting these same 20,000 spots, right? And that without considering the fact that for, hundreds of, basically 100 years, right, you've had historic labor streams going back and forth. So for the first time, right, Mexican immigration is capped. And many of the traditional migration patterns that we had long had before 1965 of seasonal labor, many of those people are now considered, right, illegal at that moment in a way that they never had been before. It's one of these like ironic.
Yeah. So you mentioned something in your book, and I think maybe this partly gets at it, but you called the Hart-Celler Act of 65 in some ways both progressive and conservative. Is that an example of how that's like an unintended conservative consequence? Like, what do you mean by that?
Yeah, I think I think it was the authors of the bill had this idea that they were sort of bringing sort of liberal civil rights to the immigration system, but they didn't anticipate and didn't sort of see the ways in which it was deeply conservative at the same time, right? That it actually created caps and restricted immigration on a group that traditionally had been entering back and forth throughout the United States, right, for the first time. And so I think that's sort of one example of it, right? Another thing I talk about in my book is I think it's going to spur a whole new anti-immigrant sentiment, right? And so while the bill itself is particularly liberal, or is intended to be liberal and sort of more focused on civil rights, it's also going to sort of spur a deep anti-immigrant sentiment in the U.S. that's quite conservative.
Okay, so I wanted to focus some on chapter 1 here because we're sitting here in Texas, and chapter 1 focuses on somewhere not too far away from here, Tyler, Texas. I don't know if we have anyone from here or from there here. And the whole chapter basically looks at this moment that involves undocumented families and public education. And this conflict eventually ends up going from this small school in Tyler to the Supreme Court. So I kind of want to give you the field here to sort of tell us about this moment. Like, what happened here? What were the stakes? How does it end up all the way at the Supreme Court?
And this is one of these cases that actually has a huge legacy today. So a lot of the conversation you have about dreamers in the U.S., right, is about access to college education. But as you may or may not know, the right to K through 12 education is not dependent on citizenship status in the U.S., and it comes from this case. So after the 1965 Act, we start to see a rise in immigration into the U.S., particularly in East Texas. It's very visible in the mid-1970s. And across Texas and Arizona and California, state legislatures start to be concerned about undocumented immigrants entering the United States. And this Texas state legislature passes a bill that allows local school districts to charge tuition to undocumented students. And Tyler waits 2 years and then announces that they're going to charge $1,000 tuition to any undocumented student in their schools, which in today's dollars is about $6,000 per student, right? So it's cost prohibitive for these families. And this is not just happening in Texas, it's happening in California and Arizona as well. But in Texas, there'd been a rise in sort of advocacy in the area around Tyler and Nacogdoches and sort of that area. And there's a bunch of legal aid lawyers who happen to be in town, and they start hearing from a local Catholic outreach worker that all these families are very concerned, right? And most of these families are mixed status families. So some of their children have been born in the US and some have been born in Mexico, right? And suddenly some of their kids are not gonna be able to go to school. And they reach out to this local Catholic outreach worker. He connects them with these legal aid, and they start taking this case to the Supreme Court. Originally, it's being challenged in a couple different areas around the country, but what takes it all the way to the Supreme Court is that there are some really big groups that get interested in this case. In particular, they're interested because many of you, this may sound familiar name to some of you who have lived in Texas for a while, Tyler is in the jurisdiction of the Fifth Circuit, and particularly it is, the district judge at that moment is a guy named William Wayne Justice, which if you have like the best name for a federal judge, right, William Wayne Justice. So Judge Justice, right, has been known to be liberal, right, and he has done a lot about voter reapportionment for the NAACP. He's been fighting Tyler Junior College about hair lengths and the Vietnam draft. And so a bunch of sort of the big civil rights groups around the country are watching these cases. And they get a phone call that this case is happening in Tyler. And they all descend, right? And they send in the sort of big money law comes into Tyler to bring this case before the Fifth Circuit. And so the case sort of winds its way. It ends up being incorporated with about 20 other cases from around Texas and goes all the way to the Supreme Court in 1982. But a lot of people weigh in and it ends up being a pretty close 5-4 decision that extends the right and argues that the state legislature violated the due process and equal protection clauses of the 5th and 14th Amendment. But it's sort of this small town case that sort of gets picked up by these like big, both on the right and the left. So on the left, it's the Mexican American Legal Defense and Education Fund, right, which is based out in San Francisco, sort of an offspring of the NAACP LDF. On the right, it's a group called the Mountain States Legal Forum, which was founded by Joseph Coors, one of the main founders in the Olin Foundation. And they sort of get involved on the other side. They are interested in Tyler because they sort of view the case as a microcosm of a lot of their causes, right? They're concerned about the trampling of states' rights. They're concerned about sort of the burden on the taxpayer, right? So they kind of come at it from they view this as an extreme example of the overreach of the rights revolution of the 60s. So you have this little case in Tyler that sort of becomes this nationwide fight between sort of big rights organizations.
So it gets wrapped up in education rights and states' rights and all this stuff. Where does it fit particularly in the story of immigrant rights or immigration policy? Because it's about a lot of things, but in your book, it's about that, I guess. Yeah.
So for many of these rights groups, right, they view this as this moment. It's sort of this pinnacle moment. They're like, okay, just like Brown v. Board of Ed, right? Brown v. Board of Ed was this moment where we took students and we used it to sort of undo this larger system, right? They're like, here's our opportunity. We're going to use undocumented students and their rights, right, as this first step in this larger conversation to be had about immigrants' rights. So they leave this 1983 decision and they're incredibly positive. Like their internal memos are like, okay, so how can we extend this to other areas? Sort of what's the next front in immigrants' rights? It turns out it's going to be a very rocky road. And sort of I write about that descent, but it's this moment sort of great hope for the rights movement that undocumented immigrants are going to have in the U.S.
Okay, so I was particularly taken, you talk about how it's this small town and then it goes to the Supreme Court, but like a lot of cases like this that become a big deal, it becomes a presidential very quickly. And so I had written down that this local Tyler story becomes an issue for the Carter administration, and then it becomes an issue in the 1980 presidential election season, both in the primaries and in the election. And I thought, since we're a Center for Presidential History, we should properly address that elephant and donkey in the room. So can you tell us a little bit about that? Like how does it get picked up in the presidential campaign and the presidency?
So early on, some of the lawyers in the case reach out to the Carter administration. And when I say they bring in the big guns, they call in the Carter administration DOJ, and Carter administration enters an amicus brief on behalf of the students, backing the students' case at the district level. And it seems for a while that that's sort of going to go. They're going to support the students. But presidential politics always intervenes. And so Texas is a swing state in 1980, right? It's a very contested election. And this issue of undocumented students not only permeates the sort of Republican primary, and there's a great clip I talk about it in the book, but you can watch it online, between Governor Reagan and H.W. Bush about this case, right? They're asked about this in one of the primary debates. Like, what do you think? Right? And Bush has sort of this much more like, he gives this answer that's sort of like, if these people are here in the United States, they should be included as part of our society. I don't see what the point of marginalizing these students does. It's sort of the George H.W. Bush approach. As we move into the 1980 election, Carter gets worried. He's very concerned about the Mexican-American vote in San Antonio and sort of moderate Republican vote on the west side of Houston, because these are some key constituencies that he needs to win in the 1980 election. And he's asked on the campaign trail repeatedly, both in Corpus Christi and Brownsville and I think 2 other places, and he sort of backtracks. He sort of says, like, he does not admit that the federal government has, under his Department of Justice, has entered a brief supporting the students. He sort of gives this, well, that's a matter for the federal courts. It wouldn't be right for me as president to weigh in, right? And sort of you start to see this backtracking due to presidential politics from the administration's perspective. Obviously, he loses the election, Reagan comes into power, and that administration is very concerned. And they end up shifting, they end up sort of revising the government's position in the case and sort of arguing that this is an issue for states and that the federal government shouldn't be taking a position. And that's sort of the federal government's, the Reagan administration's approach. And that is, fun tidbit, largely crafted by a young man in the Office of Legal Counsel's office named John Roberts.
And that's right after Reagan takes office. But it sounds like the way you're describing it, you might expect, at least given present-day politics, that the Republican president might say, hey, that's a state's issue, I'm not going to step into that. But it sounds like that's pretty much how Carter handled it as well. Is that fair?
I mean, Carter, let's remember, Carter did not love immigration as an issue, right? This was something he didn't really want to deal with. It was something that was rising concern in the U.S. He puts out a comprehensive immigration plan that falls dead on arrival because, and this is a critique of President Carter, and I think in many policy areas, right? He doesn't consult anyone in Washington before he releases his immigration proposal. He talks to some friends from Georgia and sort of introduces a bill without talking to federal stakeholders on both sides of the aisle, and it falls flat. Right, and so I think Carter felt sort of forced into that. I think the earlier position, you know, sort of at the DOJ was like more organic, and then as the presidential politics came in, he felt a little bit more restrained.
A different time. I can't imagine a president or a candidate today just, what am I saying? I was about to say I can't imagine someone just saying something and not taking the polls of Washington, but I almost forgot the last 5 years. Okay, but so there's a story that comes up at this time, and I know I talked with you about this a little before. It's not like it's a big part of your book, but it jumped out at me because I'm sitting in Dallas. This was the time, and many of you who are in Dallas or have been here a while may know the name Santos Rodriguez. This is the same time as when Santos Rodriguez was killed by a police officer. And I wondered if you might be able to just speak to that as an example of what's going on with immigrant rights, but also federal response or unease with those topics.
So for those of you who don't remember, he was a 13-year-old boy here in Dallas who he and his brother were arrested or held in a police car on the suspicion that they might have robbed a gas station. And he was shot point blank in the head by a police officer while he was handcuffed in the backseat of the car. The police officer was convicted at the state level of murder with malice. But what this moment is important for, it sort of symbolizes a little bit sort of the Carter administration's sort of debating at this moment about what civil rights is and what they want their relationship with immigration, the Mexican-American community to be, right? There's a lot of pressure from MALDEF and other groups at this moment for the federal government to step in 1977 and pursue a hate crime or sort of some sort of federal action against. The officer was only convicted to 5 years in prison for shooting him point blank in the face. And the Carter administration ends up demurring, right? They decide not to, they argue sort of this, and Griffin Bell, who's the attorney general at the time, really has a long section in his biography on this, but they decide that basically it's been too long and that's not the political influence that they want to have. And so it sort of says something about where the Carter administration is, where this question of immigrants' rights, this question of immigration, right, keeps being sort of thrown in their lap, but they don't really want anything to do with it. And they haven't really sorted out what their policy is going to be going forward, and they decide not to pursue anything against the officer.
It's a long tradition of presidents not wanting to deal with it, because when they try, it doesn't go well sometimes. Speaking of that, okay, so recently, especially maybe since 2016 or so, there's been kind of a rise in not just suspicion of undocumented or illegal immigration, but like there's a general growth of anti-immigrant sentiment in more broadly, like people with green cards or people with coming over for temporary work, that kind of thing. And that seems very recent, but you kind of trace this back maybe even to, I guess, the 70s. So what does that look like in the 70s, a rise of broadly anti-immigrant sentiment?
So I don't want to say that, and I want to clarify, I'm not saying anti-immigrant sentiment is new in the United States, right? We can go back to the founding fathers, and we have Ben Franklin is writing these missives to the newspaper about all the German immigrants in the colonies, right? And how they're, we have a long history of xenophobia in the United States. But what's sort of unique about the 70s as a moment is it's a moment where immigrants are no longer charged with the traditional argument that they're taking American jobs, right? They're also now sort of argued that they're a burden on the American state, right? This is a moment where we're starting to rethink, we're having deindustrialization, right? We're having critiques on the welfare state and the social safety net. And that's what's unique about this moment in the 70s, where it's no longer just sort of straight up nativism, but you sort of end up with this sort of narrative that's much more broadly about how, at a moment when many Americans, right, many Anglo-Americans are seeing the economy shift below their feet, right, they're sort of turning to, and the social safety net is disappearing, right, they sort of turn to this argument that Latinos, who are like the most visible sort of thing that they can see, they sort of cling on to this moment that they're a burden on the state and society, right, and they're sort of taking that sort of moment. And sort of a unique, and you see this all the way to the present, right? You think about how the argument about access to social safety net, right, is still here today.
And I mean, does that come out of, if you're talking about the 70s, I guess in my mind, I'm linking that to the expansion of these safety nets in the 60s under Johnson. What's the connection? But how do we get from there's a broader expansion of these sorts of things for everybody to an anti-immigration based on the fact that these things are being taken?
Right, and they're not related, but for a certain population, right, this is the most visible example of this underlying economic shift. And so they're just going to start blaming what is most visible, right? And they oftentimes tie, right, the Latino and the undocumented population as one and the same, right, when they're not necessarily. And so I think that sort of ties that moment. This is also a moment we're starting to see, like we often think of welfare reform in 96, right? But that's a long process to get to 96. And so we're starting to see in the 70s welfare reform under Governor Reagan in California, right? And we're starting to see an attack on sort of the broader welfare state that's starting to rise up at this moment in the 70s. I'm a huge 70s nerd, in case that wasn't clear. I love the 70s.
I'm a huge 1770s nerd. But you weren't here for that. Okay, so speaking, you brought up welfare, and so I want to jump forward in your book a little bit to the kind of I guess the later part of the book that really jumps to the 90s and the Clinton administration, and this turn toward questions about immigrants' rights really begins to hinge on questions of welfare and whether burden to the state or who deserves what. So talk to us about the 90s as this major turning point when it comes to immigrants' rights. Like, how's it being handled by Democratic leaders like the Clinton administration? How are Republicans coming to, well, in this case, maybe not coming together so much over it? So how does it become an issue, particularly in the 90s when welfare and immigration meet?
So to give a background, I'll get to welfare in a moment, but to give a background, the 90s is a kind of critical moment in the Republican Party on immigration, right? So much of the sort of pro-business, anti-regulation wing of the Republican Party has kind of dominated the Republican Party on immigration policy for most of the 1980s. When you look at what President Reagan was doing in the 1986 immigration bill, right, that sort of wing of the party still has a lot of power. When we have the 1994 contract with America and the Republican Revolution under Newt Gingrich, that power dynamic in the party shifts. And what you start to see is less of the moderate sort of pro-business Republicans controlling the immigration key committees, key legislation. And you start to see people like Elton Gagley out of California, or other people who are sort of much more restrictive on immigration come to the power center in the Republican Party on immigration. That happens on sort of the Republican side. The 1990s is this interesting moment for the Democrats because President Clinton is trying to triangulate, right? He doesn't really, he's Dick Morris's famous triangulation, right? He's sort of struggling on what to do on immigration. And initially he comes in, the 1992 campaign has almost nothing to do with immigration. Like if you go back and look at the debates, if you look at sort of whatever, there's this question of Haitian immigration, like small one little moment, but almost no question of immigration in the 92 campaign between Bush and Clinton. But California starts to have a huge rise in anti-immigrant sentiment. And the politics in California, which I can talk about more extensively, push this issue into the Clinton White House. And so California in 1992, 3, 4, is facing a huge economic downturn, right? They're lost about a third of their jobs. And immigration becomes a hot topic, both in the sort of in the 94 election, both the gubernatorial and the Senate campaigns. And a bunch of anti-immigrant activists start pushing a bill that will sound familiar to you, a state Proposition 187, which basically rules that undocumented immigrants can't have access to almost any part of the safety net except for emergency health services. And then a big part that they argue is that any state entity, meaning a teacher, meaning a healthcare worker, has to report someone that they view could be undocumented in the US. So this ballot initiative happens in 1994, and it wins big. I want to say it's like 60-40. I mean, it's a huge win in 94, and the Clinton administration is scared. They look at what's going on in California, and they're very worried because they'd won for the 96 election. They had won California for the first time since LBJ in 92, but they only won it because Ross Perot took 20% of the vote. And now there's no Ross Perot, like on the ballot. And so they're very concerned, the Clinton administration. They're like, okay, we sort of have this welfare plan that we're working on. We have some ideas about immigration. But we see this massive groundswell from California that they want immigration clamped down. And so the Clinton administration triangulates and pivots, and they start to include removing all legal permanent residents from much of the social safety net in welfare reform. And that change funds about that shift in policy, right, with removing access to SSI, food stamps, disability, what's now known as aid to families with dependent children, right, removing sort of legal permanent residents and green card holders from those programs funds about 40% of Clinton's welfare reform plan. And so the Clinton administration makes this massive pivot in 1996 to sort of shift on immigration. And the internal memos that I talk about in the book, and you can see, right, we're getting gratuitous hits on California, is literally what he says. We're getting gratuitous hits on California, and we need to pivot right. And we need a new Democrat solution, right? And so that's this key moment where you start to see both parties sort of know that the internal party politics are changing, and you start to have this moment where they really sort of start to clamp down and put into place a lot of the restrictions that influence sort of where we are today. Both I talk about in terms of access to welfare, but also in terms of deportation policy. Sort of a lot of the legal frameworks of what we have today came into place under in 1996.
So this the Clinton administration's pivot, I don't know if you can quantify this, but how much of this is driven by the Republican pivot toward a more restrictive immigration policy, a la Newt Gingrich, and how much of it is driven by more local questions of like, this California is really important. So like how much of it is a a national reason to pivot, and how much of it is a particular reason? Or is it California so important that it's a national?
So I think it's actually it's a lot of the electoral politics of California. There is a division within the White House on this question, right, of sort of where it is. But the people who end up like really holding the weight in the conversation are people like Rahm Emanuel, who's the head of the Office of Political Affairs at that time, right? He has these memos with this guy Tom Epstein. They're very worried about California in the 1996 election and sort of what are they going to do to win California. And they say that Prop 187 ends up being invalidated by the federal courts, right? It ends up never going into law. It's invalidated by the federal court system. But its legacy is much broader because it ends up shifting national policy on these issues.
I'll ask you to be slightly prophetic, which I'm supposed to not do as for historians, but like, is there a parallel to that, more recent than the 90s, or like the way you're talking about California's growing national importance makes me think of like Texas now, probably certainly one of the largest electoral political issues on the table now, like all this talk about Texas going purple and potentially going blue. Like, do you have any insight into how this is being dealt with, at the national level
so
now?
I think in my own personal take, but I'm not an electoral politics specialist, so take it with a grain of salt. I don't think the Democrats are betting on Texas as much as
Pundits
are.
That's yeah. I think the last couple of elections probably bear that out. Yeah. Constant talk and not a lot of movement. Okay, I have one more.
I do think, talking about Texas, I think one of the things that you see that's sort of a legacy of the 90s, right, is the importance of states in driving, right? And you think about the fights that are going on now about our governor's use of the National Guard, the governor trying to do things at the border independently, right? That is a legacy of the 90s. From basically 1880, there's a Supreme Court case called Chilung v. Freeman, which says the state of California wanted to charge and have its own immigration rules in the late 1880s. And the federal government said, no, you can't do that. We don't want one state to be able to ruin the foreign policy of the nation, right? And that is sort of pretty much set the federal supremacy rules from 1880 until basically the mid-1990s. And so I think with California and sort of these less direct ways, you start to see states, and now we see it in Texas, right, and our governor start to sort of encroach, or Sheriff Joe Arpaio in Arizona, right? You see this in California, like many states now are sort of forging policy in new ways.
Yeah, so like the last chapter of your book is essentially on that, the shift in power toward not just states even, but even smaller places, like local areas taking on authority that either they didn't have before or they are, that they didn't have before or didn't exercise before.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
So in the 90s, right, we have the federal government shift to sort of accommodate what California wants. But the other thing that happens in the 90s is that the federal government starts delegating power for the first time. And so to me, what was always interesting was when I worked in DC, I would always hear about this program 287G, which is now known as Secure Communities. And it's the program that allows state and local law enforcement to do immigration enforcement. Highly controversial program. Some law enforcement like it, some law enforcement hate it, right? It's very controversial. And I kind of was like, okay, how did this policy come into being, right? How do we get to where we are today? And I sort of looked back at the congressional record and I was sort of intrigued, like how did this policy, if no one's really happy with it, right? How did it get on the books? If no one really likes it for various reasons, how did it get on the books? And what happened is in 1996, and this is part of the shift, and we have rising immigration in Iowa. This is probably more detail than you need to know, but the meat packing industry is shifting in the 80s and 90s. And we're moving into places like Iowa to big meat packing facilities. Immigration comes with it, right? The sort of demographics are changing in Iowa. And there is a murder in a small town in Iowa. There's a house party and a young gentleman, 18 years old, gets killed in sort of a house party that breaks out. And it turns out that two of the people who were at the house party, the assailants, were undocumented, and that they'd been deported the year before and had made their way back into town, and the local police knew about it, but felt like they had nothing to do. And so they go to Democrat Tom Harkin, right? And they go to their local congressman, who's Latham, who's a Republican, and they say, okay, federal government, you can argue, right, that you're doing border control, but an immigration enforcement through CBP, or, CBP, or what, at that time it's INS, right? But you're not in Iowa. You don't even have an office in Iowa. Like, the nearest person is in Nevada. Like, how is that going to happen? So they make this whole argument, and for the first time in 1996, in one of this legislative package that I talk about, in 96, the federal government, for the first time in over 100 years, signs away the federal supremacy. And they allow, for the first time, the federal government to sign memorandums of understanding with state and local law enforcement to do immigration enforcement. So when we talk about all of the fights we have today about internal enforcement, right, much of that comes from this moment in the 90s in Iowa, right, of all places, right? It doesn't have to do with the border or Sheriff Joe Arpaio or any sort of thing. It comes from this moment in the 90s, right, where and Iowa politics are very bipartisan at this moment, right? And I try to emphasize this throughout this book, and I think it's important to remember. Much of the immigration debate that we have today is very much Republican versus Democrat. And that hasn't been true historically. And what we see throughout the 90s is there is much more of this sort of crossing party lines, working on different issues, right? It's not that Democrats have always been sort of pro-immigration, and Republicans have always been restrictive, right? And that Reagan, under Reagan, we see 3 million people, right, amnestied into the United States. I think it's I think part of what I try and remind people through this book is that this history, what we have now in this sort of divided, fractured, Republicans think this and Democrats think that, has not always been true. And you can't sort of just point the blame game at one party or the other. And that a lot of what we do sort of came through this through both parties working in a very distinct fashion.
That Iowa story really points to it for me, because we hear those kinds of stories regularly now about law enforcement and immigration in Austin or in a red city or a blue city. But when that moment happened, that was not part of the conversation. It was a particular issue in a particular place. Now it became political, but at the moment it was just this is an issue that needs to be dealt with. There was a moment in time when we didn't assume that something like that happened and, it's because it's a Democrat city or vice versa.
And at the time, they had very little understanding of sort of the wider implications of what that program would be.
It was highly local.
Highly local.
Okay, I just want to read, I want to open it up to Q&A here, but I want to read one of the last lines in the book because I just found it very compelling, and you can decide whether you want it to just stand on its own or if you want to add to it before Q&A. This is what it said. At the beginning of the 21st century, while many in the United States still referred to the country as a nation of immigrants, it was more accurately a nation of citizens and non-citizens, in which the benefits of citizenship had been both narrowed and denied to a very significant population living permanently in the United States. So maybe I will ask you to expound a little on that idea that it's just almost a given that we're a nation of immigrants. But your story says, yeah, sort of, but it's been narrowed in a particular way where we don't treat everyone as immigrants. We actually treat it in these boxes.
Right, if we think back to the 1960s or late 1960s, immigrants to the United States, regardless of immigration status, whether you're a legal permanent resident or you're undocumented, you had access to most of these federal programs like SSI and public education, right? And so I think, and over time, we first in the 70s removed based on authorization status, right? We remove undocumented. By the 90s, right, we're totally removing people from these programs based on citizenship status. And so I think it's just important to think about the ways in which that citizenship status really comes into sort of hard relief in the 90s as incredibly important in deciding sort of what rights you have in the United States.
It's an incredible shift. It's one of those things that's so part of the air now that you just assume it's been around forever, when actually this change is, in this way, is actually relatively recent, and that we haven't always talked about it in this way. Well, so I want to end at this part, but I would love to open this up to questions. I'm going to let Dr. Coleman kind of run that herself, but please do wait for a microphone. Just throw your hand up and we'll get one right to you so that everyone can hear, especially us. So, yeah, please, if you have questions, feel free to just throw your hand up and we'll get a microphone to you. Got one right up here up front. Is the microphone coming? Oh, do we only have one?
Well, you said that both Democrats and Republicans really had, were not in favor of immigration, but were they differently motivated? Were the Democrats worried about labor, maybe, and the Republicans worried about racism and racial purity or something like that? Were they differently motivated to hold the same position on immigration?
So it's interesting in the 70s, right? And the American labor movement undergoes a massive shift between the 70s and today. But in the 70s, the American labor movement is pushing some of the hardest restrictions. You think about the AFL-CIO, the UFW, right? They view, Cesar Chavez will eventually switch his position, but he views undocumented immigrants as strikebreakers, right? And so the 1970s, there's definitely an element of labor. And when you're talking about why Democrats in the 70s and sort of early 80s are pushing, a lot of it is coming from that element of the party, who are really concerned about labor. On the Republican side, much of the restrictionist element is a more traditional sort of nativist sentiment, versus those who are more interested in labor support more open immigration on the Republican side.
Hi, I just had a couple questions on congressional. I was interested in talking about the 65 legislation. Can you talk about the overlap between sponsors between the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, as to who, what groups were the same type of groups sponsoring both types of legislation? If not, why? I'm just interested in that. And then can you talk about, you mentioned the power shift in the Republican Party in the 90s from the moderate pro-business on immigration to, and who drove that? Why was that occurring?
Yeah. So the Hart-Celler Act is sort of, President Kennedy had actually really pushed for an immigration reform. President Johnson, upon his assassination, President Johnson sort of takes up the mantle. It's never something that Johnson himself is particularly, if you read his statements at the signing statement or whatever, he sort of takes it up as this mantle and a tribute to the president, right, to the slain president. Hart and Celler had been long fighting. It's sort of an unusual amalgamation of characters. There's some elements with the Civil Rights Bill, but it's not necessarily. A lot of the push actually comes from congressmen with significant Eastern and Southern European constituencies. Italian, Irish, and sort of not necessarily Irish, but Kennedy's there. Irish, sort of Italian, Eastern European, because they basically say they're kind of fed up. They're particularly capped. And that's why they put family reunification in as well, because they believe, most of those congressmen believe that that will allow their constituents to bring more and more family members into the United States. And the second part was? What drove the Republican Party. Right, so the 1994 contract with America, Newt Gingrich is wielding an incredible amount of power at that moment. And he is really driving the policy framework with that contract. He's kind of really edging out. I mean, I think most of the moderates following 92, right, had gotten sort of a smackdown. And here came Gingrich, and they came roaring back. Right, and sort of Gingrich is really after he gets into he wins the midterms happen in November. He starts calling Governor Wilson of California and has meetings with him about how Proposition 187 worked, how he could start using it as a model. Right, he puts a congressional committee together on immigration, and over 2/3 of the members are from California. Right, he sort of looks to sort of that model, and he sort of really drives that moment. he pushes out some of the moderates, and there's a huge tradition in immigration history of like, if you don't know what you're going to do, you're going to form a presidential commission. So like we do that in the 20s with the Dillingham Commission. We do that in the 70s. The Carter has a select committee under Theodore Hesburgh, the former head of Notre Dame, civil rights activist. In the mid 90s, it's under Barbara Jordan here from Texas, right? And so the Jordan Commission ends up, there's both congressional committees and there's this Jordan Commission that's a combination of presidential and congressional appointees.
Hi, Sarah. Thank you so much for that wonderful talk. I was curious if you could talk a little bit more about this Tyler case, Plyler versus Doe. You mentioned how in the aftermath, a lot of these lawyers were feeling very optimistic. This was going to be their Brown, but that didn't really work out for them. Can you talk a little bit about what's shifting in the courts in immigration policy that is the reason this case doesn't turn out to offer the same sort of immigrant rights that they're hoping for?
So it actually surprises many of them because it's the Burger Court, right? And so they don't necessarily, they're sort of very dubious when it goes to the Supreme Court, right? Because it's no longer the Warren Court. We've had Nixon appoint 5 members, I should know this, 4 or 5 members, right? And so the Burger Court is much more sort of restrained on these issues. And I think they think sort of this is this sort of moment, and then they sort of view that they could take it to other areas. I think what ends up happening is they realize that they're actually, these sort of decisions have provoked even stronger anti-immigrant sentiment than the cases actually initially even probably would have been there. It's always interesting to me to Tyler, like this case came out of Tyler and they interviewed Plyler as the head of the school district, which was Plyler v. Doe. They interviewed him 25 years later and they're like, why did you start charging? And he's like, well, I was worried it was going to become a quote haven for immigrants, and then I went back and looked at the Tyler School District records, right? And there's like, I think like 11 people who are undocumented in the entire school system. Like it's just not, it wasn't going to be a big, moment of shift.
That's amazing. I'm just trying to imagine the historical. The what-ifs of history,
Yeah.
One of these 11 students gets caught up in this question that becomes the Supreme Court case that drives, immigration policy for the next few decades, and it was just like, a couple families.
Yeah.
Back there.
Hi, yeah, just about the 65 legislation, you mentioned the Cold War rhetoric and trying to live up to that. I was curious if, with another part that played into that, with closing off or initiating quota for the Western Hemisphere, was the rise of political refugees from more rightist governments. Did that play any role in the language or discussions around that bill?
You mean like under
In like Latin?
Hungarian?
Well, no, I'm thinking in the Western Hemisphere, in Central and Southern America.
It's not actually a huge part, and mainly it is one congressman who is really adamant that the Western Hemisphere be included. In particular, he's kind of comes from, he phrases his argument in a like, if we're going to be equal, we really need to be equal to everyone, but it is much more he's concerned with the rise in Latino migration. It's much more of actually of a nativist, and in order to get the bill through him, he, I believe at the time, is the ranking member of the immigration subcommittee in the House. They add that cap. But I could be wrong. He could be I think he's the ranking member, but I can follow up with you about that. It's a great question, though.
Anyone more over here? Go ahead.
Hi. I was just thinking, between 1997 and 2021, it's a period of 24 years. So the presidents were Democrat for 12 years and Republican for 12 years. And one of the things I noticed, I believe there was a further push forward on an immigration bill, which I think we all understand would have had several important parts, which my recall is it was derailed in the fall, something like August or September of 2014, with the 2014 national elections, of course, in November, by the Republican Speaker of the House at the time, Boehner. I may be off there by 2 years. I'd be corrected.
Yeah,
I was disappointed then because I thought, look, we've known for decades we need to have an improved broad spectrum immigration bill. It's been hard for our national politicians to get it done. And so I suppose I've asked you, you know, two questions glommed together, but one is, in 24 years, our presidents have been evenly divided as to political party. There have been several thrusts to get an immigration bill to solve problems at a deeper level. The one I remember is 2014, and I'm sure Speaker Boehner was motivated, you know, by a number of things, but obviously there's the heat of the national election played a role. Do you have some comments about the evenness of the presidency for a quarter century? I know things have changed since, you know, the last 1 year, but speaking of the previous 24 years, the presidency, what role is the evenness of the presidency played on our immigration issues? And secondly, did we get closer to trying to make a significant decision or passage of law, meaningful law, in 2014, or am I off on that? And you have other periods in the last quarter century that you would point to instead.
So I think we have two very significant moments where we almost get to comprehensive immigration reform, and one's under a Republican president and one's under a Democratic president. So in 2006, under George W. Bush, right, we get very close to a comprehensive bill, and he is thwarted by members of his own party in the House, Republicans. And that is a very hard moment for the George W. Bush presidency, is my understanding. I think they felt like they were really close, you know, because we have this massive bill in 65, we reform it a little in 86, but basically nothing's happened since 86 in terms of sort of a major comprehensive bill. And we have these changes in the 90s. So I think 2006 is a huge moment, and then 2014 again under President Obama, right? We have this question, and so we sort of, both presidents have come incredibly close, much closer than we are right now. The bill that we have now is basically dead. Some people call it on life support, but I think it's dead. And I think those were sort of the two key moments in 2006 and 2014, and both times, both presidents, regardless of party, have been stymied by House Republicans. Sort of, I'm gonna put it.
You have one more? You have a question? Last question. We'd love to.
We can chat.
Hello? Okay. All right. Hi. Thank you so much for coming to speak to us. So my question kind of deals with kind of like the previous question, the current day affairs of immigration. So it was very interesting to me how much like an outside exterior event completely changed the mindset of a party going into an election, like how you said what happened in California, completely changed what the direction of Clinton's administration. So I was wondering if in today's administration, if there's like an anti-immigrant push or even a pro-immigrant push that's changing or affecting the policies of today.
I think the Biden administration, and I'm going to talk about the last year, right? The Biden administration has really struggled. They have, from the start, they actually put into place a ton of administrative changes that activists wanted. Over about 100, 120 administrative changes that they could do. but they have failed on comprehensive, right? We now have the Senate parliamentarian 3 times sort of arguing that whatever the Democrats want to include can't be included in reconciliation. And so I think right now it's unclear that there's that game-changing moment, right? I think we're sort of in this stagnation moment. And so what's interesting to me about this moment is the Biden administration is really struggling, and they still have in place Title 42 and a lot of things that are making immigration activists very worried. And the question that sort of, to me, is in moments of federal inaction before, like during the 70s or in the 90s, right, or early part of the 90s, right, states and locals sort of sweep in. And so the question I have, and we see this in California, right, California has passed many laws that do immigrant integration, right, with driver's license and access to in-state tuition at California schools and all this stuff. What's that going to look like now? If people have put a lot of weight over the last year and a half into federal reform, and if that's dead, what is sort of that next sort of outlet going to be? And is it really going to be at the state level, in which case I think it could be a lot more fractured. I don't necessarily know if that's like a driving moment, but that's sort of where I would go with it.
All right, I'm stealing the mic to close it. Can you all join me in thanking Dr. Coleman for this evening? I'm sure she'd be happy to talk if you have a few more questions, but I want to encourage you. There's a handful of books for sale right outside. You can get your own, and there's all kinds of lots of stories that we didn't get to discuss tonight that you can read for yourself. Thank you again for coming. Please keep up with the next things that are coming, and we'll see you soon.